Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
At last, a new law will allow Minnesota driver's licenses to fully comply with federal standards. We'll get the details. And Republican leaders tout their successes while Governor Dayton leverages his concerns. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Minnesota's long and arduous journey toward compliance with the federal government's 2005 decree that states enhance the security of state-issued forms of identification has finally come to an end. Joining me in the studio is the author of the bill that got the job done, Senator Eric Pratt. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Besides the fact that the state was running out of time, why was this the year that Minnesota, one of the last holdout states, finally got this legislation passed?
Well, I think it was because we were running out of time. Some of our citizens were starting to be inconvenienced, and then certainly the signage at the airport warning them that their IDs wouldn't be good in January 2018 started putting the pressure on. So I know I and a lot of my colleagues started getting emails from people who just said, get it done, work together and get it done. But I've talked about an email I got from a mom who couldn't get into a military base to see her son in the infirmary, about a gentleman who had a reservation at the White House and got a letter from the White House saying he couldn't enter with his Minnesota ID as well. He'd have to bring a passport or some other credential. I think that's really what spurred it on, was the grassroots level looking at it and saying, what's the holdup?
Yeah, so the pressure building for Minnesotans who were just starting to run into roadblocks.
Yeah.
I noticed, as you mentioned, at the airport over our spring break, lots of signage alerting people to the necessity of having these new IDs by January of next year. Minnesota will not yet be compliant by January of next year. Does the state need an extension?
Yeah, the governor has already sent the Department of Homeland Security a request for an extension. And if they follow what they've done with other states, I'm confident we'll get it, which means that our deadline will actually be moved to October of 2020. And so we'll start, at least the plan right now is to start issuing those IDs in October of 2018, and we'll have 2 full years of issuance before the deadline.
Can Minnesotans still opt out of getting this type of license if they choose to, if they just prefer to use a passport instead of having this additional form of ID?
They can. You know, one of the arguments against the Real ID was that this was a federal mandate. Well, the state had a choice of whether or not to comply or not, and we're offering citizens a choice of whether they want the Real ID or to keep the standard. If they're concerned about their privacy and some of the hype, they can still get the ID through the same process that they already have. But yes, they can. And because we have a choice and because consumers have a choice, I just don't see it as an infringement on our constitutional rights and our sovereignty as a state.
And you mentioned data privacy, because that's the one area where people had concern, because now there's additional forms of identification required, and some of that, I understand, will be saved in databases. How confident are you that Minnesotans' information will be protected?
Well, I think Minnesotans' information is as safe as it is today. You're right. There's no new documentation that's needed in order to get a driver's license. What we've done is the federal government's narrowed the list of credentials that you can use to prove your identity. So for instance, in the state of Minnesota, we'll accept a tribal ID to get a driver's license. But the federal government won't recognize that for federal purposes. So they'd be able to show a passport, a birth certificate, or some other pre-approved credential. There's no national database that's being kept. There will be some saving of documents, your birth certificate, those types of things, but they're protected by our state's cybersecurity infrastructure.
Now, I know some people don't necessarily have access to a certified birth certificate or something. It costs extra money to get those. Is there anything in place to help people who are having trouble getting those things? I'm
not aware of any problems. That hasn't been raised in any of the discussions that we've had.
Okay.
There are plenty of options for Minnesotans to prove who they are under this list of federal approved documents. It's not one or two, it's like a list of 9, and I just don't recall them off the top of my head.
Well, I will send people to a site where they can find that out. What is it about these new licenses that's going to make them more secure? What are they harder to forge, and how can the state ensure that you are who you say you are?
Well, what really comes down to is what are the credentials I'm using in order to get the ID? The driver's license will look exactly the same as it does today. The only difference will be there'll be a little gold star up in one of the corners that will indicate that it's a real ID and able to be used for federal purposes. Other than that, there's no change. They're not telling us what we need to put on our driver's license other than that emblem. They're not making us change the format. They're not making us add a chip. It looks exactly the same as it does today.
How much does implementing this law cost taxpayers, both in terms of the new equipment required to make these, because don't they have like some kind of chip included in them? So there's that cost, and then there's just also the cost of getting a new license. So let's start with the bigger question. How much does it cost taxpayers to roll this out? So
it's going to cost about a little over $3 million just to do the programming. But that's one-time expense. Again, there's no chip in the real ID.
Oh, there's not?
There's not. There is in the enhanced ID, but not in the real ID.
Okay.
And so it'll look exactly like your license. So it really doesn't cost that much. Most of the cost of getting a new driver's license will be covered when you go in and do an early renewal. We'll charge you a fee, but then you'll be able to extend your expiration date out to 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years, depending on how far out when you get that early renewal. So that's how we're able to keep the expense down, but it's really a one-time programming cost of about $3 million.
And then, but when I go in to renew my license, it's not going to cost me more to have this real ID than it does for my old?
Real ID costs exactly the same as the current ID, and we put that in statute.
So in terms of what citizens choose to do, it's really up to them. Do you want to be able to fly without having to bring your passport, or do you want to make sure that you have your own data, separate? So it's really just now a person's choice, what they prefer.
Exactly, and that's why we ran it this way. We wanted Minnesotans to have a choice of which type of ID they have. And the other part of the law is we're now going to expand and have enhanced IDs available at every driver's license bureau. Today they're only accessible at about 14 statewide. And so those can be used as a passport card to drive into Canada or Mexico or leave and enter the United States on a ship. And so offering every type of ID that we have at every license bureau statewide will just add to the convenience and help Minnesotans find the ID that best fits their needs.
Senator Pratt, thank you so much for coming today. The legislature completed the special session with the passage of a $650 million tax relief bill, nearly $500 million transportation package, and $950 million for public works projects. It was action that Republican leaders hailed as a great success.
It really was a historically productive session. Republicans in the House and Senate worked together. In the end, we reached out to the governor as well, and look what happened. We have the largest tax bill we've had in almost 2 decades, with relief to just about anyone you can think of. We have a transportation bill of $300 million plus money in the bonding bill, so it's over $500 million or $500 million that we're putting into roads and bridges, and that's really, really a good thing. But gridlock was unlocked as well. You think about some of the things around here that we've never been able to do in the last 5-10 years. We got Real ID done, which was very, very important for people that wanted to fly. We got it done. And then if you look at simple things like Sunday liquor, that couldn't be done, and that was done as well. And so everywhere you look, things happen. Gridlock was unlocked, and significant reforms and tax bills and bonding bill were done.
Really happy with the way session ended. I think I would agree it was the most productive session in recent memory. The fact that we were able to accomplish the largest tax bill in the last 20 years, the largest transportation road and bridge funding package ever that didn't include a gas tax. We're really proud of those accomplishments. And we got a lot of other things done as well. So we also think the fact that the surplus that was available, about 2/3 of that surplus was used for tax relief and for transportation for roads and bridges. We call that a great success. So we're really thrilled with the way session ended. Really excited about the road and bridge dollars, excited about the tax relief, and frankly, we're excited to go out around the state and talk about it.
I think this is really a victory for middle-class Minnesotans throughout the state. The tax relief bill that we put together, again, historic tax relief, and it affects middle-class families the most. couldn't be happier about that. And the transportation package is going to help throughout the entire state of Minnesota. So I think that this session has been a historic win for Minnesotans.
I, of course, am most excited about the transportation bill, the largest transportation bill in state history, frankly. And there's a lot of pent-up demand for transportation projects, so we've front-loaded this with lots of bonding money in both GO bonds and trunk highway bonds. Also, the Real ID project, I happen to be involved with that as part of the conference committee. Great news for Minnesota citizens that want to fly an airplane. Speaking of airplanes, there's lots of funding for airports in the transportation bill, too.
Nobody got everything they wanted, and frankly, the governor had to give up some things, but we also had to give up some things. So I think that represents the compromise that Minnesotans were looking for this session.
The positive mood Tuesday morning shifted by afternoon when the governor called a news conference. While he did sign the tax and budget bills, he line item vetoed the legislature's funding, action that GOP leaders quickly ruled as unconstitutional. Governor Dayton said he would call a special session to enact funding for the legislature with renewed agreement on these 5 issues: rescinding tax cuts on tobacco products, estate tax reductions, and the freeze on business property taxes. In addition, Governor Dayton would like to further negotiate teacher licensing and the new restrictions on driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. On May 8th, Governor Mark Dayton signed a law that will allow the state to issue driver's licenses and state identification cards that meet federal security standards. Joining me in the studio to discuss the rollout of the law is Director of Driver License and Motor Vehicle Registrations for the state, Dawn Olson. Welcome.
Thank you.
When is the rollout of these new cards? Everybody wants to know how they can get their Real ID compliant license.
Sure. Well, the law that was passed and put into place says we need to be issuing cards by October of 2018. We are certainly on task. That is our target, to be issuing the cards by then. We have a lot of preparation work that we need to be doing to get everybody ready, including staff, external partners that also issue driver's licenses. So we're working with them to start the training process. We have a lot of communication pieces that we need to put together so people are very aware and informed about the different IDs and what it will do for them. We have a computer system that we are working to stand up, so we've got those pieces in place, and we'll be issuing all brand new cards. We have a different ID card altogether that'll be coming out in 2018, so it'll all line up along with the Real ID issuing at the same time.
So it seems like this could be a little bit confusing because there's going to be Real ID compliant, and then a person doesn't necessarily have to get the Real ID compliant if they don't choose to. How will these two cards look different?
They are going to look different. They have to be identifiably different, so those from a federal agency, when they view these documents for people trying to make entrance, can easily view them and make a determination. So your Real ID card is mainly going to have a gold star on it. That's an indicator of a Real ID compliant card. For other non-compliant cards, such as the current driver's license we have today, it's going to have wordage on it that'll say not for federal identification. So the federal requirements ask that we make sure that there's distinguishing features between those two cards for ease of use and understanding of those that need to verify that information.
Is there a cost difference between these two cards?
No, there will be no cost difference. It'll cost exactly the same. Both cards will be exactly the same. So when people come in, they won't have to pay extra for a Real ID. They'll just have to make a choice on whether they do want a Real ID card or they want to stay with what we're calling a non-compliant card, and that's the one that can't be used for federal purposes.
So if somebody does want a Real ID compliant card, do they have to bring extra documentation to prove that they are who they say they are?
Yes, that is the national criteria around a Real ID, that you have to do a little bit of extra work to be able to prove your identification. So in the past, when you came in for a driver's license, you just attested to your address, your social security number, who you were. Now for a Real ID compliant card, you're going to have to bring in proof, which will be your identity, and that could be a birth certificate, something of that nature, maybe a passport, something that proves you are who you say you are. You're also going to have to show your social security card or something that has your social security number on it. If you don't have a card, it could be a W-2 form, could be your tax return, something like that. And then in addition, you have to show proof of residency. So you're going to have to show 2 forms of residency documents. And that can come in a wide variety of forms. That could be your utility bill, it could be your cell phone bill, it could be your rent agreement. Anything that shows your name and your home address will need to be included as proof of your residency and that you are a resident of Minnesota and you do live here, you have a residency.
Now, I know this is a ways down the road, but then when you renew
Yes.
a Real ID compliant license, say 4 years from now or whatever, will you still have to show all this documentation once again?
No, once you've shown it once, that's all you have to do. The only time you're going to have to resubmit information is if you have a name change. You're going to have to bring in documentation to back up that name change. Also, if you move, you'll need to bring in the same residency documents again, so we can verify that it's a different residency. But otherwise, if there's no changes, then it's just going to be a standard renewal process.
One of the reasons why I think this got hung up for so many years was concerns that people have over their data privacy and the protection of their data. Does the department store some of this sensitive data that people will be showing, and how protected is that data if you are storing it?
Sure. Security is a #1 priority for the Department of Public Safety. We do carry and hold a lot of secure private data on individuals, obviously because they're identity documents. So security is our top priority. We have a new information system, like I talked about, that's going to be coming in, that's going to provide state-of-the-art security. We're going to be very limiting on where people can go that have access to our system, what kind of information they can see, because some of that information is a little bit more sensitive than other, especially a social security number. So there are very limiting opportunities that people will be able to see this information as well as access these documents. We have to keep them for proof that we verified this information. Although the bill that was signed, people do not have to leave their birth certificate. They can make that as an option. We have to gather the data from a birth certificate, but we do not need to keep a copy of that. So that documentation just becomes part of their record. It's held in a secure location, and like I said, it's very limited on who would have access to that information.
Are there rules then governing how that information would be shared, say, with a federal agency or with another state?
Yes, absolutely. We have very strict rules around who can have access to our data. We comply with those rules. But there are some steps with the Real ID law that we do need to verify information on individuals. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One is obviously for identity. We want to make sure you are who you say you are. But secondly, really around public safety. We don't want to issue a credential to somebody that may have a bad driving record in another state, and they're not eligible to drive in another state. So the practices and the steps we take are really around security and safety, and that we're doing the credential for the right reasons to the right person.
Director Olson, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Sure, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
The Minnesota State Capitol Restoration Project is nearing completion after a $300 million investment and over 3 years of painstaking work. With more than a century of use, the Capitol building had reached a critical point in deterioration. The exterior marble and stone were crumbling, and the building had antiquated heating, electric, and plumbing systems. Upon completion, this historic restoration project will make our Capitol viable for the next 100 years. Now is the time to take a free guided tour, see the restoration effort up close, get an overview of Capitol history, art, and architecture, and learn more about the workings of state government. Our Capitol has the second largest self-supported marble dome in the world and is a national treasure right here in St. Paul. Tours of the Capitol leave at the top of the hour and are 45 minutes in length. Tours begin at the Capitol Information and Tour Center, located in room 126 on the first floor, just to the right of the south entrance. From now until June 9th, guided tours are available to visitors Monday through Friday from 9 until 4, Saturday 10 until 2, and Sunday 1 to 3. Beginning June 10th, guided tours are available Monday through Saturday from 10 until 2 and 1 to 3 on Sundays. Please note that groups of 15 or more people require an advance reservation. To make a reservation, call 651-259-3003 in the metro area or 1-844-667-8679. Or you can visit the Minnesota Historical Society's website, mnhs.org/Capitol. Mark your calendars for the official Capitol Grand Opening, August 11 through 13, marking the completion of the restoration. This free event will reintroduce our state's architectural gem with a celebration that all Minnesotans can be proud of. Expect activities for all ages, music, special tours, and other events throughout the weekend. Nearly $500 million will be invested in road and bridge construction as a result of action this session. Those funds will be generated from state surplus and bonding, but there are many ways Minnesota pays for roads, highways, and transit. Producer Jon Brune explains.
Transportation is financed in Minnesota through a series of established funds in the state treasury. Some constitutionally created and some created by statute. State revenue sources are deposited into those funds, then distributed to various modes of transportation in the state.
The main fund in Minnesota that funds roads is called the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. It's so called because it collects the three main user taxes that fund roads in Minnesota and distributes them to some other funds that go to various types of roads. So the three main user taxes are the gas tax, and that is constitutionally dedicated 100% to be deposited into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The second one is the vehicle registration tax, which is again 100% constitutionally dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. And the third is the motor vehicle sales tax. That one operates a little differently because only 60% of it is dedicated to the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund. The other 40% is dedicated to a transit assistance fund to fund both metro and rural transit systems in Minnesota. So those three main user taxes flow into the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund, and then there's a constitutional formula that allocates that money out of the fund to state highways and some other local roads.
Allocations from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund are dedicated by the state's constitution. The first 5% is set aside and can be directed by the legislature for any of the allowable purposes under the fund. The legislature can change the areas of distribution every 6 years. Currently, the 5% set aside goes to town roads and bridges and other local turnbacks, which are former state roads being turned back to local control. The remaining 95% of the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is divided into three funds. 62% is directed into the Trunk Highway Fund. This is the main source of funding for the state highways of Minnesota.
The Trunk Highway Fund uses largely our state road construction, operations and maintenance of state highways, program delivery for construction or maintenance programs for state highways, and also the operations of the Minnesota Department of Transportation so that they can operate and fully service these highways. The legislature can also authorize trunk highway bonds, which are paid back in future years out of the Trunk Highway Fund using revenues flowing into the fund. 29% of the allocation goes to the County State Aid Highway Fund. This fund provides resources for the operation and maintenance and construction of county state aid highways, which are a collection of key roads in counties. They might have higher traffic volume, they might be regionally important to connect important centers in the county or even inter-county roads. The parameters are set in statute. The money again flows out of the County State Aid Highway Fund to particular counties by a formula set in statute. The third fund that receives revenues from the Highway User Tax Distribution Fund is the Municipal State Aid Street Fund. And just like the County State Aid Highway Fund, it funds certain roads in municipalities that have sort of a key importance. Again, maybe traffic counts, maybe large connector routes, things like that. Allocations are limited to those cities in Minnesota with a population of over 5,000. Historically, smaller cities under 5,000 have not had a dedicated source of revenue from state resources. Several years ago, the legislature did enact a new program, the Small Cities Assistance Program, and put in an initial funding of $12.5 million for fiscal year 2016. There was no funding for fiscal year 2017, but the program is established and there is an allocation formula in statute now for when that fund receives money. There is a formula for how the small cities receive some assistance. Otherwise, small cities are largely dependent on local assessments and property tax to fund their own roads.
The Transit Assistance Fund and the State Airports Fund provide necessary resources to keep these modes of transportation functioning.
The Transit Assistance Fund receives revenue from the motor vehicle sales tax, which is split between Metro Transit Systems and Greater Minnesota Transit Systems. It also receives revenue from sales tax and motor vehicle leases, which is dedicated only to Greater Minnesota Transit in the fund. But transit systems in Minnesota also receive general fund appropriations in their biennial transportation budget, and that goes to fund their general operations. There's a general fund appropriation made to Metropolitan Council, who oversees the Metro Transit system. The general fund appropriation for Greater Minnesota Transit Systems is made to the Department of Transportation, which operates it through agreements with local providers through their Office of Transit. The State Airports Fund receives revenues from a number of sources and is then appropriated in the biennial transportation budget to the Department of Transportation and their Office of Aeronautics to provide resources for the state's airports for operations and maintenance, for navigation aids, for airport development, maybe adding or improving a hangar, runway improvements, things like that.
Money from the federal government also plays a significant role in funding Minnesota's transportation needs. Federal dollars may flow directly into certain funds, or directly to local governments or to the Department of Transportation. Sometimes these dollars require state or local governments to match the federal contribution in order to receive the funding.
Federal funding is a large part of particularly state highway funding in Minnesota. That is a huge source of revenue for the Trunk Highway Fund in particular. Federal funds are also used to fund local roads projects, state airports projects, and transit projects in the state. Federal dollars flow into the Trunk Highway Fund directly and are used as trunk highway dollars on specific projects. And in other ways, for, say, local road projects, there might be the locals might have to put up a match and to receive some federal dollars, and that could flow directly to the locals. Some of them flow into the Department of Transportation through the state aid office. Great many airport projects also receive federal funding this way, and it's set up on a match system with what the locals put up, sometimes what the state puts up, to match the federal dollars for a specific airport project. And again, that usually flows in either to the local authority on the airport or through the MnDOT's Office of Aeronautics. When it comes to transit, the federal government is very involved in especially big projects like light rail construction currently in Minnesota. The Federal Transit Administration, when they choose a project that they're going to fund through a state, they will pay 50% of the construction cost. And in Minnesota, the rest is borne out, the remainder 50% is borne out by state funds, by local funds, and by the county's Transit Improvement Board, which is a joint powers board of several metro counties that collect a sales tax in the metro area and put toward transit projects such as light rail.
Learn more about Minnesota's transportation system by following this link.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Lurkey, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.